Hello, my name is Pastor Russ Foust. I am pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in Kennard, Nebraska, and this is our first attempt at having online streaming of a sermon. So join with me for the sermon of March 29th, 2020. It's entitled Just Like Me, and it's based on John 11, verses 1 through 45. If you've ever heard me preach before, you have no doubt heard me tell you that I have problems with certain passages in the Bible. Passages where the stories don't fall into alignment with how I think righteous people should act or be treated. The parable of the prodigal son was one of these. When I was a younger man, I sided with the oldest son, who I felt was not properly treated at all. If the younger son wanted to run off and waste his inheritance, well, that was his problem. To be pushed aside as the broke and destitute son returned by the father, well, that just was not fair. But now, as I have had my own children to care for, I can see that story from the perspective now as the father, and understand better what Jesus was saying. As you can tell, then, I've had problems with today's gospel lesson. Here we have Jesus who tells us to love one another, and he tells us that we should treat each other as we would like to be ourselves treated. And he ignores the aid for request from one of his best friend's sisters. Jesus heard their cry for help, but instead of immediately heading out and racing to their home near Jerusalem, he tarried where he was for 2 more days. How could he have been so uncaring? I thought that he should have dropped everything and rushed to his friend's aid. We don't know how much Lazarus suffered in his last days, but as loving sisters, Mary and Martha were undoubtedly beside themselves with first worry and then grief. Jesus might have been able to prevent or certainly to shorten their heartache. By the time Jesus and his entourage arrived, it had been 4 days since Lazarus' death. His body had been lying in the tomb. 4 days of death. Well, that's not something that an electric shock from a modern AED or an injection of the latest wonder drug will be able to bring you back from. Even those people there knew that it would not be a pleasant thing to open that tomb. And then to have Lazarus walk out, well, that would take a miracle. A really big miracle, and yet that is what Jesus provided. Jesus was recorded as restoring people back to life on 2 other occasions in the Bible. Once in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17, where as a funeral procession was passing, Jesus felt compassion for those who were grieving and told the dead son of the widow to walk again. The other time was in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 50, when a temple leader by the name of Jairus came to Jesus, intending to ask Jesus if he could heal his sick daughter. But by the time Jairus finally sought out and found Jesus, word arrived that the daughter had died. Jesus went to Jairus' home nonetheless, and despite a lot of mocking comments for those in attendance at the place, he walked out with the daughter alive. These 2 stories caused Jesus' reputation as a healer and as the Messiah to soar. But today's story tells us of action that pushed the Jewish leaders to take action to put an end to the whole Jewish movement. He had to be disgraced and silenced for all time. When Lazarus walked out of that tomb, it was the last straw. The high priest figured that since Jesus was in town, the plans were set, the moment seemed right for the leaders of the Jewish church to put into action Project Kill Jesus. Another issue I have with this story is that after Jesus meets up with his 2 sisters and those friends and family who are weeping and sharing in their grief, we hear that he became angry in verse 33. We're told that he was troubled. Why would this anger Jesus, I've wondered? Why would he have found the weeping of a loved one in grief and in sorrow to be something he was angered at? The last thing I questioned was the fact that after being angry, then Jesus wept. If he was angry, why was he later brought to tears? The apparent contradiction of Jesus' behavior and the way in which I would have expected him to act made this passage difficult for me to understand. But now with a bunch of years of experience, including both good and bad occurrences, I'm beginning to understand just a little. I see Jesus as more of a human and less than a deity. One of the problems I've had throughout my life is that I tend to procrastinate a bit. Okay, more than just a little bit. And in our gospel lesson, I can see Jesus procrastinating, just like me. Hence, the title of this message. I'm certain that Jesus knew that he was coming upon his final days here on earth. I also believe that Jesus knew that what was in store for him. Maybe he wasn't happy about what God had called him to do. I speculate here, though. That's not to say that he refused to obey. But as that final day approached, I'm sure he became upset, thinking about his end here, as any human would be. And that's another key that, like you and like me, maybe Jesus didn't want to go through something that he thought of as unpleasant, because he was, after all, human. As I said, the miracle of bringing Lazarus back from the dead was major news, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Before Jesus came to Bethany, where Mary and Martha lived, he was relatively safe. But to have to go back into the hornet's nest of Jerusalem and perform that really, really big miracle, well, I can understand his hesitancy. After all, Lazarus was and would remain dead. There was no real hurry in that. And he knew that his relatives would be grieving some, but perhaps it was easier, for a little time at least, to wait to pull the trigger that would begin the series of events that would result in his death. Jesus must have been struggling to suppress his emotions. He saw the faith and belief of his true believers, and he had to contrast that with the corruption and wickedness of the Jewish leaders, as well as some of those who he had called friends. Yet everyone, good and bad, would benefit from the sacrifices God had called Jesus to make. It would have been frustrating to sacrifice so much for those who didn't seem to deserve it. And also, I believe that Jesus was not prepared to personally experience the tears and the sorrow of Mary and Martha. It's one thing to acknowledge someone's grief from a distance, but it's altogether a different experience to be with those who are in anguish for someone you love. His anger that we heard of perhaps may have been directed at himself for the pain that results from procrastinating, for I know this anger. In the midst of tears and sorrows of others, it is often impossible to stifle your own. Jesus, even though he was the Son of God, was human in all respects. And it is in this new revelation of Jesus that I find the most comfort. In this frame of mind, I have come closer to him. He knows the fears and the nightmares that I have. And he knows the pain and disappointment, both physical as well as emotional, that I encounter. The procrastination problem that I have had all my life, well, maybe Jesus had the same. He is just like me. As we continue on our journeys on paths that we never thought would be ours, it's good to know that in the unknown regions in which we are wandering, that Jesus is with us. He knows what it's like to be required to do things that we'd really rather not do, yet do them we must. And on these new and uncharted paths, we resist the changes that we must make, and yet we are forced to change. It's just like that sometimes. We try to escape by avoiding those responsibilities and hide, yet we're forced to comply. In a time of fear, in this time of panic, we don't need to panic. We just need to maintain our faith, for Jesus will show us the way. If he did try to avoid that final miracle and postpone activating this mechanism of his death for a couple days, I can certainly understand that. Because perchance in this respect, Jesus is, again, just like me. Which means that for me not to follow his lead would be silly, because it really isn't all that difficult. He knows me, and I'm beginning to know him better. If there is procrastination in your life, rejoice. For Jesus knows the pain and anxiety of that. He knows that anger with yourself when you're forced to deal with the consequences of delaying what must be done. And knowing that Jesus knows does somehow make it easier to put your foot down and put an end to that stalling. Take some time during this lull in activities and begin working on some of those unpleasant or feared tasks. There may be some pain, but remember, avoiding unhappiness is not the road to happiness. Jesus is. May God bless.